Today I'm joined by a man who has lived at the sharp end of public service for over 6 decades. Lord Geoffrey Dear, former Chief Constable of the West Midlands Police, Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, His Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary, and a crossbench peer in the House of Lords. He's been described as one of the most respected police officers of his generation. From the Brixton Riots to the aftermath of Hillsborough, from armed standoffs to reforming British policing from within, Lord Dear has not only witnessed history, he shaped it. But today we ask a deeper question. What does happiness mean to someone who has carried such immense responsibility? Lord Dear, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Steve, it's a very great pleasure to see you again.
Okay, well, there's a whole series of questions to ask you, broken down into a number of parts, and I'll just introduce the parts before starting the questions. The first part is all about the man behind the medals, reflections on life and leadership. So to kick things off with the first question, you've had a life of great responsibility and danger, from leading police forces during riots to surviving 3 assassination attempts. But when you look back, what have been your happiest memories?
I was blessed with a very supportive home life, and I think that's important for anyone in any big, complicated job. My first wife died untimely, very young, with cancer, but she saw me all the way through my professional career, and I had that as a sort of bedrock, foundation, if you like, and that was intensely rewarding, and I think that's important. It's not essential in public life, but my goodness, it helps if you've got it. And in terms of career-wise, I think that happiness and job satisfaction is really the same thing. Do you get job satisfaction in whatever you're doing at whatever level? And if you've got that, and if you feel that you're achieving whatever it is you set yourself as a goal, then life is actually pretty good.
The purpose, having a purpose to get that job satisfaction is key.
Yeah, I knew you'd ask something about this, and I gave job satisfaction a fair bit of thought. And I think there are 4 things that might run as thread through much of what we're going to talk about today. I think there are 4 factors you need in any work to get job satisfaction. First of all, the boss has to be known and identifiable. Now, in a very large organisation, that's difficult, and we could talk forever about how does the boss gain some sort of visibility. But from the people working within the organisation, the boss has to be something more than just a name on a sheet of paper, a name that you occasionally can bump into in the newspapers. It has to be something with a personality attached to it, however you manage to get to that position. So that's the first thing, a visible, recognisable boss. Secondly, what is the boss looking for today and this year and this month? Not in generality terms like, we're in the business of keeping the public safe. Of course, that's so in policing. But what are the specifics that we're trying to achieve this week, this month, whatever? And drill it down to detail. So visible boss and identifiable objectives. Thirdly, what do I, as part of the organisation, way down in the organisation perhaps, feel that I am doing to help achieve that? Maybe a very small cog in a very complex machine, but it doesn't matter if you know that what you're doing helps to get the boss to where he wants to go. So visible boss, an identifiable set of objectives, and what you're doing to get there. And probably most important of all, are you valued? Because if you feel valued, if you feel recognised, if you feel that you are part of the system and the system acknowledges that and you, then likely you will go home feeling that you've done a good job. If you're not rewarded, if you don't feel that you're part of the team, if you feel that you've been ignored, then likely you're going to be very unhappy.
I'm smiling because you've said the word valued there, because that's something that you were known for. You were renowned for it. From all the comments that I received that we'll talk about in a moment, you absolutely made people feel valued, those that work for you. Moving on then, you led two of the country's most complex police forces during immense societal change. What helped you personally stay grounded and well over those years?
I have touched upon it before, and that is if you have a basic, happy, well-founded, well-cemented home life, that's a great help.
Yes.
If you feel that within the workplace you are more or less getting what you wanted, you're never going to win them all. But if you yourself feel valued, if you yourself feel that you are achieving what you set out to do with support, then that's hugely rewarding and important. And again, turn it on its head, if the boss feels he's not getting what he wanted and is not understood or being driven off course by the winds and changes that go on around him, then yes, it's a different matter.
You were awarded the Queen's Police Medal for Bravery and the Queen's Commendation for Brave Conduct. What do those moments and those honours mean to you now?
Well, I don't suppose I've changed my mind really. You feel very proud to be recognised. You feel that you've done a good job, and it's very nice to reflect when you look in the mirror that you've got a couple of medal ribbons to prove it. I think looking back on the incidents, we won't go into what they were, but when you look back on the incidents shortly afterwards, you knew at the time you were doing a job and you didn't think too much about the consequences, but you do reflect and think to yourself, well, wasn't I lucky? If it had gone the other way, I could easily be in a very different place.
A victim rather than...
Yeah. So, yes, pride and reflecting on luck and good fortune as well, I think.
Well, this next question, I think, overlaps with a question that you've just answered. You've described your leadership style as shoulder to shoulder, being out with the frontline officers at 2 a.m. What did that teach you about people, morale and leadership?
Well, I learned a lot when I was staff officer for a chap called Bob Boys, whose name won't resonate very much in Birmingham now, but he was Chief Superintendent way back in charge of the old Birmingham City Central Division. And he became Deputy Chief of Mid Anglia, which I was serving in at the time when I was his staff officer, and then went on to become Chief Constable of the Yorkshire Force and died untimely. He was a super man, commando in the war, decorated for gallantry in the war, always giving good advice. And one of the many things he used to repeat to me as his staff officer was always spend 10 minutes every day with the cleaner. And what he meant in shorthand was you've got to talk to people who are doing the real work. It doesn't matter who they are, where they are, when they're doing it, get out and talk to them. And I took his advice and found it was hugely rewarding. One or two tricks of the trade, you don't always do it between 9 and 5. You do occasionally go out at funny hours and meet them. You always tell them you're coming, otherwise they think you're snooping. You recognise that they are probably rather pleased to see you. They're also rather pleased to see the back of you. They don't want you around for too long. But the fact that you've bothered to go and you are talking to them on their ground. You've come out of your cave and you've gone into their cave, talking in their office or by the side of their car on a street corner or whatever it is. If you've bothered to do that, you will get the message of what it's really like at the sharp end, because nobody else will ask them. But the fact that you've done it, and the fact that not necessarily everyone will have met you doing that, but they know somebody who has, or I used to do it in London, 40,000 employees in London. You go to Croydon or Barnet or West End Central, the chances of meeting everyone was pretty well zero. But the fact you'd been to West End Central or Croydon would resonate around that division, and they would know that somebody had come out of the head office, New Scotland Yard, and talked to people that they knew. And they'd been recognised and remembered. And then, of course, the conversation in the canteen is, did you tell him about? Did you tell him that we're off with whatever? This system doesn't work. That equipment is not up to tick or not. You pick up the vibes very quickly.
As an early advocate of racial awareness training in the Met, especially in the wake of Brixton, what pushed you to act at a time when such issues weren't always welcome?
Well, some of the views weren't always welcome. There was a school of thought in the Met then, changed now, of course, but in the Met then was the law is the law, and it doesn't matter who they are, they'll obey the law. And we will trample all over ethnic sensibilities or religious sensibilities. We'll just uphold the law, which is fine so far as it goes, but you have to enforce the law, I think, with a degree of understanding of the people that are at the other end of the spectrum. So in those days, for example, with the Bangladeshi community, if you go in and start talking to the woman in the house, then it was an affront to her and an affront to her husband. You didn't address a Bangladeshi woman in those days in the presence of her husband. It would have changed now, of course, generations have changed. But that is an example of where it was in the 1960s. You had to be aware of those religious and ethnic sensibilities. Otherwise, you were going to upset people unnecessarily. And racial awareness training was all about trying to get new recruits who'd come from probably very privileged backgrounds to understand the environment they were going to be policing in, and to understand where some of the people who they would meet had come and what their attitudes were. You still enforce the law is the same for everybody, but at the same time you need to understand the sensibilities of the other people.
You were known for earning respect from protesters as much as from politicians. How did you balance firmness with humanity in high-pressure situations like the Garden House riot?
The Garden House riots were in Cambridge. I'd just taken over. Took over 2 days after the riot. I wasn't at the Garden House riot, and by today's standards, it was pretty lukewarm. But it was big news at the time, and it was a big thing in its day. Students rebelling against the Greek junta and picketing a hotel, and quite a lot of damage caused. It was at a time internationally, I remember when the whole of the Western world was being turned on its head by student protests, partly to do with Vietnam, partly to do with the Greek junta and the rule of the colonels, and partly just a change in society. And there were international agitators moving around from continent to continent who badly wanted to see literally blood on the streets. The National Guard had shot students dead in Kent University in America. Telegraph Hill in San Francisco was a hotbed of revolution. And the international people wanted the same sort of thing happening in Cambridge. And Cambridge had taken to sitting in Cambridge colleges. They'd taken over the administrative centre for Cambridge University and so on. And so I took over, and it seemed to me that if we went into in hard, as the American police had done, and indeed the French and German police had done with their own demonstrations at the same time, we were playing into the hands of the internationalists who wanted to see that sort of thing.
They wanted violence.
And so I called a meeting with the student leaders, or the student agitators, if you like, in Cambridge University when I took over, and said, look, we can arrest you if you want that, if you're looking for that, but we will help you demonstrate, if that's what you want, marching or concerts or whatever else, but you're going to do it on the terms that we set down within the law. And would you believe they did it? The international people like Tariq Ali, Rudy Duchka, Danny Cohn-Bendit, all came and tried to whip up the Cambridge students into a position where they were confrontational with us in order to get the sort of thing that was happening in the Sorbonne or in Bonn or Berlin. And what they found was some sort of pact between the police and the demonstrators, that the demonstrators were getting publicity by demonstrating within the law, and we weren't beating people over the head or firing tear gas. And it seemed to work.
What message, changing the subject, what message would you offer any serving or retired officer watching this podcast, especially those who served under your command in either the Met or in the West Midlands?
Oh, I think the big message, the big thing I have to remind myself on is things change. It is very easy for people in my position to look at the news and say, it was never like that in my day, it's all gone wrong. That's the wrong approach. Society has changed hugely in the last 30 years. And I think all of us have to remember that change is remorseless. And policing will change with it. In this country, policing and society and change are interwoven in a way that you wouldn't find abroad. The police in most countries elsewhere are very much law enforcers. The law is the law, and you get on and enforce the law. And you don't take too much account of what is changing around you. But my constant reminder to myself is don't be too quick to judge what's going on around it. Things have changed since we were there.
Ahead of today's recording, I reached out to serving and retired officers across several police groups with an invitation to submit their own questions as part of what I called Ask the Boss campaign. The response was overwhelming. Over 140 questions and messages, all respectful. They came flooding in, which speaks volumes about the admiration that you still command, Lord Dear. You kindly selected a few of those questions to be included in our discussion today. So with your permission, I'd like to intersperse them as we continue. The first question comes from a young lady called Christine Slade, who by coincidence I served with Christine at Erdington Police Station before she rose through the ranks. Now, she's asked 4 questions for you. She's been cheeky. She's asked 4 questions, but they're all similar. The first question is, which part of your career, your whole career, did you enjoy most?
I knew you would ask this, and I gave it a lot of thought, and you may not believe me, but there's no doubt the thing I enjoyed most and remember most was when I was a PC and a sergeant in uniform. Working with the team, very different times in those days compared with today, and yet it's still the same dynamic, that you're part of a group. Hopefully the group have got all the right core principles in place. You're proud to be there. You want to be there. It's part of a team. And you don't get that as you move higher and higher in rank. You lose that corporate identity with the close-knit team around you. So, yeah, the answer to that one is, looking way back, it was forgetting all about night shifts and early turn and all that sort of thing, and all the inconveniences and the boredom.
It was more of the camaraderie.
Yeah, it was. You remember the good things, and the good things was camaraderie. Your words.
Where did you find or feel the most satisfaction? Was it from that same time, or was it from a later time?
No, I think the satisfaction probably comes when you can engineer change. And you engineer change, I think, if you are, I think the terminology has changed now, but divisional commander would be one. Chief superintendent in charge of a division, as we used to call it, would be one. Maybe as an assistant chief, but certainly as a deputy chief or chief, when you effect big change, you get satisfaction from that in a way that because you've got the levers of power and authority around you, and you can pull those where you can't as a PC, obviously, in the same way. So the satisfaction comes in engineering change, I think.
What was the most, this is the third question from Christine, what was the most frustrating part for you?
Climbing up the ladder and finding you're dealing with people who've got political agendas or different agendas that don't chime with your own, and try as you may, you can't see where they're coming from, except that they are quite definitely opposed to what you would want. And you're, of course, convinced that you're right. And the frustration grows. Budgetary constraints, all of that sort of thing interwoven. The higher you go, the more frustrating it becomes, I think.
And finally, from Christine, any regrets?
No, I was incredibly lucky in my career. I suppose I was presented with opportunities and grabbed them. And many people don't get the opportunities in the first place. But I don't have regrets. You look back, road less travelled sort of thing. I wonder what would have happened if I had taken this route or that, made this decision or that one. And you muse on how things might have changed had you gone down a different road, so to speak. But no, I don't have regrets, no.
Another question from another officer, David Michael Faulkner, asks the question, having seen the decline of structured police training colleges like Ryton, and now hearing reports of unacceptable behaviour from some new officers, do you believe that the lack of discipline in current training environments is contributing to the problem?
The short answer is yes. I do agree with him. I think that the old training model, certainly the one we introduced into the Met, which was my very first job when I went into London in the Met and watched that model rolled out through the Met and then through the rest of the country. It became the national standard through the 80s, late 80s and early 90s. Was a good one. I would say that, wouldn't I? But it was based on a great deal of research. You had to fight very hard in those days to get into the police. And the first thing, the sieving out process was considerable. The training program was a long one. It was a very detailed one. It was designed to equip you for the job to come. It was also designed to sort out people who were undesirable for whatever reason. All of that tended to go in the early days of the Blair administration to save money. And that's a woeful commentary on short-termism,
Yes.
because you can cut training and cut recruiting and standards and cut training at your peril, really. And I think things have gone steadily and slowly downhill in that sense since. I'm not a fan of the modern system. I think the old system, or the elements of it, were better. And I think that the problem that Mark Rowley, for whom I have huge respect as Commissioner of the Met, is sorting out a number of problems within the Met, which are all stemming, I think, from the recruiting and training system that was in place in the late 1990s. People who you don't want tend to stick, and people you do want either progress or leave. And that's an unhappy position.
Sad indictment. Brian Davis asks, what are your thoughts on police crime commissioners?
I think Theresa May did two things as Home Secretary that have damned the police service. One was to do away with the Staff College, which was internationally recognised, and we needn't go into that. And the other was introduce police and crime commissioners. You might be interested in the way they came about. The Prime Minister of the day went and gave her the brief. I think police and crime commissioners are a bad idea. They grew from an idea that was spotted in America, particularly on the east coast of America, where the police chief is totally beholden to an elected individual, either the mayor or a police director.
It's meant to replace police authorities, wasn't it?
Police authorities, which I always worked, had their own dynamic, it is true. And sometimes you got on well with them and sometimes not. If you work very hard at relationships, you could usually get a concord that worked with a police authority. You had to listen, you had to recognise where they were coming from, but it worked. Police and crime commissioners, one man, usually a man, sometimes a woman, sitting in face-to-face with the chief constable, works in America, where it was copied from the east coast of America. But it was always said, I remember when it came through Parliament, and I sat in and took part in the debates about police and crime commissioners, the promise from government on the parliamentary system was that police and crime commissioners would be top quality. They would be retired lieutenant generals. They would be retired cabinet ministers. They would be retired diocesan bishops, people of note who'd done it and been there. That didn't happen. And what we're seeing almost without exception are second-tier politicians, local politicians, who are trying very hard to move into the top tier of local politics, who have not got the experience.
Elevated councillors.
You could put it in that term, and that's not too far from the truth, on a one-to-one basis, and the power to appoint and sack the chief constable. Oh. Now, you work the dynamic out very, very quickly. It doesn't take much thought to think that you get a subjugation of the chief constable and the role, and the whole force begins to degrade. And that too often is the position, I think, and it's at the door of police and crime commissioners.
Thank you. This is one that I remember because it's what brought you and I together, I think. You once suggested that police leadership had been in decline. More than a decade later, would you say things have improved or worsened? And what kind of leadership do we need now?
I think I'm too far removed now from the detail of policing to be unduly specific. But what I would say is it does seem to me, looking at television and reading the newspapers and watching life generally, that leadership is in very short supply across the board.
Oh, yes.
Not only in police. I think we've got a society which is completely enmeshed in management. Management is all about schedules, it's about budgets, it's about timescales, it's about all that mechanical stuff, and is very important. And it's a science, somebody once said. Leadership, which is about engaging people's minds, engaging their will, they want to do or not to do certain things, is very much an art. And we're in a society where everything is measured. Everyone has a tick box approach to life. You get it because we're computer driven, I think. You pick the telephone up and go through to the gas board, and you know that the question you've got doesn't appear on the screen at the other end, and you're not going to get very far because the things that really count in life are not measurable. Things like humanity, things like applied common sense, things about judgment. All of those things which are so important and which are enmeshed in leadership, because they can't be measured, are not on the rubric of most people. And I think the police service is in the same boat. We are besotted with management and managers, and although the people at the top of any organisation, including the police, will tend to say, well, I'm at the top, so therefore I'm leading, they're actually not very often. They're very often just managing, and they're not inspiring and moving forward in the way that they could do.
Do you believe policing is still a noble profession? And what would help restore morale and public confidence?
Well, I suppose I've answered the latter part of that. I think if leadership came in and a feeling that the workforce, policing workforce, felt valued and were doing a job which was supported, the morale would go up, undoubtedly. Is it a noble profession? Yes, of course it is. Reflect, if you like, on what happens in a nation, any country, with a complete and total breakdown of law and order. The very first thing that is put in is not the National Health Service, it's not the army, it's not new roads or schools. The first thing that goes in always is law and order. Now, forget how it comes about and the form it takes. Order and rules and a structure, if you like a better word, in society is absolutely essential, on which everything else hangs. And so therefore you have to say that policing, which is all about structure and making life in all the country safe and predictable in it to some extent, has to be noble.
This next section is all about the world today, policing, society and inclusion. Today's police forces face low public trust, complex crime and increasing non-crime demands. It seems a policeman's lot is still not a happy one. Do you see any global models or solutions that might improve policing in the UK?
I was very fortunate in the last, I suppose, 10 years of my service to travel quite widely and look at and engage with other police forces in other countries. And I have to say that the models pretty well everywhere are different to ours. A lot of them are purely about law enforcement. I mean, let me tell you one story which may prove the point. Whenever a police officer meets somebody who is outside the police service and declares they're a police officer, it becomes known in the conversation. Almost always the person who is meeting the police officer will start to tell the story about the last time they met a policeman. I was on the M1 the other day when I was stopped by and my house had broken into and the police came. I guarantee you that in this country, that story related to the police officer will, within the first minute or even less, engage with a comment about the attitude of the police officer. My house was broken into and the police came. They were very nice about it, or not, as the case may be. They can go either way. But the attitude of the police officer is absolutely essential to people in this country. And it took me a long time to spot that, and to spot that abroad you wouldn't get that. People would still tell you the story. I was in central Rome the other day when such and such happened, and the police came and they would never introduce the attitude. Law enforcing, police came, did something, I did something, and etc. The interrelationship of the public and the police in this country is almost unique. And with that interrelationship is attitude. And that's something that I have not spotted anywhere else in the world. And that's what sets British policing apart, I think.
So in that respect then, the question was, did you see any global models or solutions that might improve policing in the UK? I think the answer to that is probably no. There's nothing out there.
But there's a lot that you can pick up.
A lot you can pick up to improve it.
But in terms of a total model, no, there isn't one.
No. Another question from the officers. A chap called Alan Jones has asked the question, or made the statement. In the past, HMIs played a role in selecting chief constables, but now the police and crime commissioners appear to have sole influence. Do you believe His Majesty's Inspectorate should still be involved to ensure strong leadership appointments?
The old inspectorate were heavily involved, and so was the Staff College, and so was the whole system. It built up a cadre of people who were right for promotion, and then the HMI would advise, we wouldn't have a decision, but would advise the police authority on the appointment. That has changed. I mean, we've already talked, I think, about my views on police and crime commissioners who don't want advice.
Yeah.
Certainly don't seem to me to want to take advice very readily. The inspectorate has changed. It's much more now an audit organisation than it was before. We try to lead a region. We had a quarter of the country, so 4 of us, quarter of the country, and you try to lead the region in a way which was almost like a group of companies. So you were chairman, in a sense, sort of chairman of a group of companies for Company Reed Police Force. It was a different model. But the short answer to your question is that I don't see any influence on police and crime commissioners who are given the power by their role, or the role that they've accepted. They're their own boss, and they don't take advice too readily.
If the PCCs have no experience in appointing chief constables, surely their role should be more of a minor one than a major one in the whole process.
The model was that you would have really top quality people as police and crime commissioners who'd harvested a huge amount of experience in whatever they had done before, in the army, in the church, in civil service, whatever, business, captains of industry, all that. You haven't got those. By and large, they are not in place. And so you have people who have not had that sort of experience of running a very big, very expensive, very complex organisation like a police force. And you get what you pay for.
I was going to say, is it then possible then that the police commissioners' appointments might not be what we need in terms of the quality of leadership?
They're elected, of course, on the same ticket as the local election. We know that the turnout for the electorate for the local elections is very low, 25, 30, 45%, something like that. They're being elected in on the same ticket as local councillors. They want to be many of them want to be in a more significant role within the local authority setup than they've got as a police and crime commissioner. It speaks for itself.
Okay, you've worked closely with international law enforcement and helped shape Europol. What did those experiences teach you about collaboration, crime and happiness on a global scale?
I had a lot to do with the founding of Europol. I had a lot to do with the extradition treaty that we negotiated with the Spanish to stop the sort of Costa del Crime syndrome that was going on in the 1960s, 70s, early 80s, when many of the the serious end criminals were going down to Spain and running their business from there because we couldn't touch them with extradition. So yes, I saw quite a lot of that. On an international scale, crime more and more and more is international.
Right.
You see it with drugs, with people smuggling, with white slavery, with everything is on an international scale.
There are no borders anymore.
If there are borders, they're transparent.
They cross them, yeah. You've seen how fast social media and public attitudes can shift. Do you believe the pace of modern society has made life more difficult, or is it just simply different?
Oh, it's more difficult. I mean, anyone who says that they want change to slow down or stop is trying to stop the tide. I mean, we have had change remorselessly since the world began. So the difficulty we all have in every nation is the speed of change. And the speed of change now is remorseless and very fast, particularly technological change.
AI, yeah.
And hanging on to that and trying to keep up with it for anyone is difficult. And it keeps changing the goalposts, as people sometimes say. If you change the goalposts for policing, of course, you're all over the place. And yet, society is being changed and itself is driving change, two things in place at the same time. It makes policing very difficult.
How do you feel about the growing movement for neurodiversity and inclusion within the police? Should forces be doing more to embrace diverse thinking and capabilities?
I don't think I'm qualified to answer what is going on now. I take the point, and I think I've addressed it elsewhere, that that you, if you see policing as purely law enforcement, it becomes very simple and very robust and not very pleasant for the people in society who are receiving it. So yes, you have to in the English or British police model be aware of all the nuances in society without being totally sidetracked by them. There has to be a time when you say, look, there is a balance between what society as a whole wants, what the law as a whole wants, and individuals. And there's often on that crunch point in the middle, there are casualties of thinking, and there always will be. What we have at the moment is people who are pursuing one particular viewpoint, who have, through social media as much as anything, who are able to make their views very vociferous and very loud. And that is something that has only come about in the last 20 or 30 years, I suppose. And it's easy to be sidetracked by that. How you balance that extremist, call it an extremist view, if you like, or minority view, how you balance that against the majority view is a balancing act for politicians and also for law enforcement. And it's not easy.
You've spoken about the decline of trust in not just policing, but across society, from politics to healthcare. And I think this touches on what you intimated earlier. Is this, in your view, a leadership issue? And what might help restore public belief in institutions?
Well, the big institutions, I think that we held out in my childhood and prior to that, certainly since the Second World War, the things we were really proud of, the health service, the new education system, the way in which the military was run, policing for sure, and so on, the church, all of those have declined in public acclaim, all of them. And that, I think, is due to the complexity of society itself, the way in which there was a deference within society. I don't mean a slavish adherence to class, but there was a mannerly society, which is not necessarily always seen today. So there was a structure there. And the challenges that have been thrown in the face of people in positions of influence or authority. When I was a young cop, you could walk down the street and you knew automatically that you had the majority of society was behind you. And if you said do something, they did it, usually without complaint. Try it now. Tell a group at 2 o'clock outside a club which is turning out, tell them to do something, and likely, if you're unlucky, you're upside down in the gutter, because the challenge to authority, whether it's the church, the parental system, the school, the police officer. The challenges are all there, and they weren't there 20, 30, 40 years ago.
A question from the floor again, a gentleman called Mike DeMuth. Many forces now advertise preferential recruitment for ethnic minority groups. Whilst we must reflect society, do you believe recruitment should be strictly merit-based, regardless of background?
It should be strictly merit-based. It doesn't matter who you are, what sex you are, what colour you are, what religion you are. If you can do the job and measure up to the standards, then you should come in. West Midlands, I know, was very conscious of the fact that we didn't have a representation from particularly what was then called the Afro-Caribbean Society, West Indian, some people would say. And they were not measuring up in sufficient numbers in school, and therefore weren't getting past the basic test for educational requirements. And we set up a system whereby good quality recruits who measured up in many other ways could go at our expense to, call it night school in shorthand, to bring themselves up to the right standard. I think you can do things like that, but in the end, to get through the gate, you've got to meet the standards that the job demands. And you should not be making concessions by taking people of certain colour, certain ethnic background, certain religion, just to get those numbers in. Mm. If you can do the job, you should be in. If you can't do the job, I'm sorry, you won't get in.
Thank you. Okay, well, we're on to another section now, the third section. This is all about the Global Happiness Crusade, which is my bit, I suppose, and its vision for the future. We're building a movement to make happiness and well-being central to how we run businesses, schools, governments, and even technology. What are your thoughts on this type of vision?
Oh, I think it's admirable, and I applaud what you're doing. I think the word happiness needs fleshing out. We all know when we're happy, you wag your tail and smile, and you're talking about something actually much more deep-rooted than that. And we might have touched upon this earlier on in the interview when we talked about job satisfaction and acknowledgement within the workplace and indeed at home. But in terms of do we need a work where people feel, where people feel that they are recognised and valued, then yes, of course you should pursue that.
So if we imagine if schools measured emotional intelligence and creativity as seriously as they do test scores and exam results, would that change how people would grow in society?
The old idea of education was you needed to do the 3 R's, wasn't it? Reading, writing, and arithmetic. Yeah. You had to be able to read, you had to be able to count, and you needed to be able to write a fair fist and write a letter. Beyond that, the education system that I remember was all about trying to develop people, their understanding of nature, their understanding of religion or of history. There was a great deal of broadening going on. Mm. And I think we have become bewitched, and we've touched on this before, bewitched with test scores.
Results-driven.
Results. And I think that needs harnessing and probably curbing. Education is all about, it seems to me, moulding somebody helpfully in a way that makes them bigger and better for society.
Mm. Requires a different level of teaching ability, I think, educational knowledge.
Either that or the way in which one actually measures and promulgates education, define education, yes. I suppose, in a sense.
Yeah. Should we track things like gross national happiness, the successful model that originated in Bhutan? Should we track this alongside gross domestic product to give governments a fuller picture of national well-being?
Well, you can certainly track the gross national product quite easily. At the moment, it's dire.
Yeah.
And it's dire because we know it's dire and yes. We don't know what to do with it. If you can get a handle on how you measure happiness, then fine. And I would say yes. The problem is, of course, trying to measure it.
I think the big problem is nobody has asked the questions. Nobody has thought to set out the questions that need to be asked of the public. I can't recall a politician ever approaching me and saying, "What do we need to do to make your life happier?"
Or fulfill you.
More fulfilled. Those questions just simply don't get asked. And if the questions are not being asked, how can they possibly measure whether we are happy or not, other than the discontent?
Well, I suppose it comes back to almost what we were talking about with leadership and management. We are besotted with things you can measure. And you're talking about things that are very difficult to measure, and yet you know whether you're in an enriched or a barren sort of environment within society. You know it, you can see it, you can feel it, but you can't measure it.
Yeah.
And it's getting a handle on how do you measure it. Maybe you don't measure it. Maybe you just say to people, do you feel valued?
Yes.
Do you feel that your view is taken into account?
Be interesting to explore the Bhutan model a little bit deeper.
And I know nothing about
to find out how they established that their people were happier. I mean, they appear in the top listings all the time of countries.
Very
in the world. Very small country, a low population.
Buddhist.
Yes, and it's changing. It's rapidly changing at the moment. There's a lot of opposition to some of the things that are happening, but they still remain happy, the bulk of the people that are there. But as you say, it's a smaller population, so it's a different dynamic. Today's technology platforms are brilliant, but often they're addictive. If you could advise the next generation of technology leaders, what would you say to them?
The next generation of technology leaders seem to be congregating around the White House at the moment. And I'm not sure that that's a very good model. Harnessing the best things from technology is, of course, the trick, isn't it? And we've all seen people absolutely besotted with the phone in the middle of in the palm of their hand. I think it has led very rapidly to a society which is over-focused on self, over-focused on entitlement, over-focused on rights rather than responsibilities. I mean, the Greek philosophers, Aristotle in particular, always talked about if you're given a right, there is always a balancing responsibility to go with it, and we've forgotten the responsibilities very often, but we're completely bewitched with our rights. All of that can be driven the wrong way by technology, and I think at the moment probably is. What you do in the future, and to get the balance back in is a trick, which I hope is exercising politicians, but I'm not sure that it is.
I think a lot of technology is driven by the media. The media have a large influence over it, and the media, in our experience, they deliver more negativity than they deliver positivity, because negativity attracts more views.
Oh, I mean, yeah.
Positivity doesn't.
Bad news always sells better than good news.
Yeah. One of the things that I used to cause me emotional problems when I was a police officer was reading so many bad news stories about the police and so few good news stories. And I knew that so many of us were working our rows out to help the community and to help people. But we weren't, the recognition wasn't there. And I think that's an example of it. It's an example of... I
think society, by and large, is able to make its own mind up and would say, well, we see all this bad news, but on the whole, we think you're doing a pretty good job. I mean, that would have been the view, I think, probably until 7 or 8 years ago anyway, about policing. Policing has taken quite a pounding recently because of 1 or 2 very high-profile cases, which are awful. 2 or 3 of them in London. And we needn't go into the detail of those other than to say that in the end, of course, it takes you a very long time to build up a reputation, a good reputation, and you can lose it in 5 minutes.
Yes.
And having lost it, it takes another very long time to build it back up again. And what the Met are doing and other forces are doing is a long, hard road to rebuild responsibility. I'm sorry, rebuild reputation. And it will take time. Okay,
we've probably covered this in general terms, but I'll ask this question anyway. What would a well-led country or organisation actually look like to you? What values or behaviours would stand out?
Without getting into the theological argument, I think one of the problems we've got in society is that the old religious, biblical, Ten Commandment type mantra, which everybody knew and responded to in one form or other, on the whole, have been diluted or brushed to one side. And my view, to answer your question, is that we need leadership, again, the same word, we need leadership from the top, whether it come from the church, from Parliament, royal family, the shakers and movers of society, to say these are the principles that we stand by. And I think those you call it moral compass, if you like. You could argue that I think society has probably lost all or part of its moral compass. It is now looking, searching for a lead, searching for a set of standards that they can live by. And whether the society as a whole recognises that, or is it's happening subliminally, I don't know. But it does seem to me, with a horrible generalisation, that we are in a point in history where those certainties are not there, and society is wafting about left, right and centre because they're not there and not recognised. How you get them back, tricky.
Okay, we're on to part 4 now, which is all about peerage, Parliament and personal beliefs. So you were made a life peer in 2006 and served as a deputy speaker. What has that chapter of public life meant to you?
It meant a huge amount to me. It was sometimes said, it would be said to many chief counsellors, have you thought of going into politics? And my answer to that at that time was yes, and I'm not going to. Because you're used to having you have to have political independence. And to go into Parliament, particularly into the House of Commons, would mean you had to have party allegiance. In the House of Lords, about a quarter of the House of Lords are appointed not by the Prime Minister but by an outside body. They're called crossbench, non-party aligned. And I came through on that ticket, so I didn't know my appointment to the Prime Minister of the day. Not whipped, was chosen because of the experience that they thought I could bring in, as all crossbenchers are appointed. And you're your own boss. Can be lonely because you don't have the party machine around you. If you want to drive something forward, you're doing it on your own. You haven't got a party machine to come in and help you and take you through. So it's a hard road to hoe if you're going to try and make change. I was very fortunate. I engineered a number of quite significant changes early on, particularly in my time, and 10 years, I suppose, in the early stages, and then the last 7 years also as Deputy Speaker, or one of the Deputy Speakers. But what did it teach me? It taught me that you have the ability to effect change or to support change in a way that very few people are gifted. And that's a rare position to be in, and one that should be valued.
You've been a strong advocate of reforming the House of Lords. What reforms would you personally champion?
Oh, I have a model for the House of Lords, which will never happen because Prime Ministers, when they're in opposition, talk about changing the House of Lords. As soon as they get in, they realise they've got patronage gifts and they can fill the House of Lords up with people to whom they either owe money or owe favours, and then nothing gets done. My model for the House of Lords would be that the power should still stay with the House of Commons, who are elected. The House of Lords should be a revising chamber, which it is now, acting a bit like the headmaster sending the homework back, 3 out of 10, try again. I mean, I jest at that point, but you're in that sort of
role
of trying to make things better. I would certainly have it all appointed and not with parliamentary, with prime ministerial patronage. And of course, that's never going to happen. But my model would be outside appointment, House of Lords down to about 450, with the lifetime ticket taken away and probably going to leave at the age of 70 or 75, which seems to be the retirement age for most other organisations. it would be a much tighter grouping of people who are there purely and simply for what is believed they can bring experientially from their past. Now, that won't happen. For political reasons, it's not going to happen, but that would be my model.
Lord Dear, as a crossbench peer and someone respected for your political independence, you've seen the inner workings of government up close. The British public have expressed growing dissatisfaction with politicians and indeed the political system itself. You mentioned to me that you have something to say about politicians. So I'll ask, what are your thoughts on the current state of politics, the wider political system and democracy here in the UK?
One thing on your intro, I of course saw a bit about the way government works, but being in the House of Lords, you're very closely involved in the parliamentary system rather than governmental system. There is a difference. But yes, you do get a unique view from there. What do I think about the current role? I think far too much of politics, and certainly the politics in the House of Commons, the criticisms can quite easily be tracked back to the fact that the people who join as an MP now tend to see politics as a career. Whereas before, not so long ago, most MPs had made a career doing something or other and been successful in it and had brought experience with them. And now the current crop of MPs, and for the last 15 years probably, have more and more been dominated, not entirely, but dominated by people with no experience of running anything. And yet they suddenly find themselves into positions of huge influence. Simultaneously to that, the civil service have been pushed to one side in favour of what people call SPADs, special advisors, something that Tony Blair brought in. And special advisors have eclipsed, to a large extent, the role of the civil servants. So you've lost two things simultaneously: experience from the MPs and the experience and the influence of the civil service. And so you get a very different political scene now, and it's not one with which I'm comfortable. And I think the discomfort with the general public of politicians generally can be tracked back, a lot of it can be tracked back to that position.
And do you think that's affecting democracy as we enjoy it?
Well, I mean, Churchill once said that democracy, or words to the effect of democracy, is not a very good idea, except it beats what comes second best. It is flawed, of course it is. Yeah. It was flawed from the days that the Greeks invented it in what, 3000 BC?
That's right, yeah.
But at the same time, if you don't have a democratic model, which most of the Western world has got, what else are you going to have in its place? So you accept it with its flaws and inherent weaknesses. I think the role modelling that used to go on, where you could look at either the leader of the parliamentary party who was in, or indeed the opposition. You might not agree with the opposition, but you could respect the people who were occupying those positions, has to a large extent been diluted. And it's been diluted because A, you don't know who they are. B, if you do know who they are, you don't much like the way they do it. And you don't like the way they do it because they're demonstrating very often their ineptitude to exercise that role. Now, that's a generalisation.
Yes.
But there's too much of those three things, I think, in play at the moment. And that leads people to saying we've got to have something different. And one last comment is that because life is so complicated and so complex, it's almost an impossible job to give anyone to say in a democratic system, how are you going to run the country? And I hear too often people almost banging the table. Sometimes they do bang the table, but almost metaphorically banging the table and saying, what we need is really good, firm government. Be careful, because that firm government thing brought in Stalin and Hitler and Mussolini and Franco and all the rest. I think what they're really saying is what we need is clear government. We don't want a set of politicians who promise one thing in the manifesto and then promptly tear it all up and go in a different direction.
Yeah.
Who are doing U-turns, who don't know where they're going. They're buffeted they're affected by outside influences rather than driving change from
within.
From within. All of that is bad news. And all of that you will find right the way through the European system. I was on the European Select Committee for a long time in the House of Lords, and we looked outwardly away from this country into Europe as part of our brief. And you would find these criticisms in most of the big European countries, certainly the big established ones, Germany, France, the Netherlands, Sweden, all of those would be saying more or less what we're saying. Life is getting very complicated, and how you handle it needs a very deft set of politicians.
Okay, a couple more questions from the guys out there. A lad called Andy Brazel has asked 2 questions. How would you have coped working for a police and crime commissioner yourself?
I wouldn't enjoy it. If you can hammer out or arrive very quickly at a working relationship with mutual trust and respect between the two of you, then the model is a good one in theory. I think too often, because all the power, hire and fire power, is with the one individual, usually a man, as a police and crime commissioner, you are going to be, you're subservient.
Yes.
You know that at the end of the day, you can be sacked by this guy who's got very little restraint legally on him or her.
And potentially very little experience to make the decision.
That's right.
Okay, Mark, Andy's second question relates to somebody whose name you mentioned earlier. Mark Rowley, you recall, worked under Andy at Digbeth CID. He's now Commissioner of the Met. How do you think he's doing?
Well, I knew Mark Rowley. He came in on the graduate entry scheme into West Midlands not long before I left West Midlands. And I remember seeing him when he joined. I remember going to see him in hospital because he had not been out long on his own working beats when he was very seriously injured in, I think, New Street, certainly in central Birmingham. And I went to see him in hospital, and I visited him once or twice at home as he was recuperating. So I got to know him in a way that I would not get to know everybody. And then watched his career from a distance and have admired him ever since. How is he doing in the Met? He's now fashioned his own team. He's got a stronger team around him. But he's inherited all sorts of problems that were there from two or three commissioners back behind him. That's the first thing. He's already said it's more difficult to get rid of people you don't want than should be the case, and he's right on that. He's seen, 4 Home Secretaries in his term? And that has to be bad news. You can't constantly have the Home Secretary being changed around your ears when you're Commissioner of the Met. He's good, there's no doubt. He's absolutely gilt-edged, but he's working in a very difficult environment. And I think people who want to see rapid change in the Met are going to be disappointed. The Met is so big and so complex that it's the oil tanker syndrome. It takes a long time to turn it round.
Yes. A final Ask the Boss question, which comes from, and I apologise if I pronounce his name incorrectly, Russ Lum. Given your experience, would you prefer an effective police committee or a resource-heavy PCC structure? I think you more or less answered that. But
I think the old model of police authorities, or they used to be called police committees, but police authorities, the same thing, was a good one. It worked. Very rarely did it not work. And sometimes it didn't work as much as anything. The problems were caused by the chief constable rather than the chairman of the authority. The point is, with an authority which reflects all of the political parties in that area and magistrates as well, you'd got a base of common sense. And if one grouping was going off rogue, if you like, to use a not very well thought through word, but if one went off at a tangent, the others would bring them back in. It worked, and it worked very well. And the fact that it was changed, I've already said, I think is society's loss.
As someone who opposed extended detention powers and defended free speech, do you still worry about the balance between security and liberty today?
I made a bit of a name for myself, I think, being rather big-headed about it, which soon after I got into the House of Lords. Off the crossbenches, I stood against the government who wanted to extend the the period that you could keep a terrorist suspect in custody from, was it 28 days to 42 days? 42 became the gold standard that the government were pushing for. And they were doing it in order to try and head off criticism that the government weren't doing enough to protect society from terrorists. Because at that time, terrorists were starting to drive motor cars and vans on pavements and kill lots of people, and death and destruction was their mantra. And I knew, having been heavily involved in counter-terrorism, that we didn't need 42 days. We didn't need anything past about 14 days. We should be pushing it backwards to 14, not out to 42. And if we went to 42, all you were doing was giving the terrorists the ammunition to say this is a repressive society and look what we're fighting against. And so I took the challenge, I suppose, in the House of Lords. When the bill came from the Commons to the Lords, I ran off the crossbenches, the opposition to the government of the day, and brought in a majority of well over 100 against the government, which was actually the biggest majority on any subject in the House of Lords for over 30 years.
Right.
And for the 2 years following, when I remember Theresa May was the Home Secretary, she brought in, or tried to bring in, for the same sort of reason, two amendments or two clauses in a bill which would actually, I thought, curb free speech and curb the freedom of association, one in successive years. So for 3 years in a row, I was taking on the government off the crossbenches, and each time got a majority of over 100. So that's my background. I think what people sometimes call Magna Carta principles, they're not actually in the Magna Carta, but principles that we've lived with in this country for certainly the last 350 years are worth defending. And it's difficult for the police. Freedom of speech means that people march up and down and block up the streets of London frequently. But the alternative is tear gas, tanks, total repression, and you're looking at something like North Korea, which I don't think is an admirable model at all. So in the end, you go with the fundamental rights which are important, and you try to make them work. And you don't try to curb them or alter them.
We're on to the final section with a few questions, and it's all about wisdom, legacy, and reflections. You've led through war, terrorism, reform, and crisis. What do you hope your legacy will be in public service?
I think any legacy that I left in the police service is long since gone, because in the police service it's like building bricks in a wall. Other people come afterwards and they add bricks to your wall, and then it becomes their wall, and anything you've done largely is submerged. I've already mentioned, I think some of the things I did in the House of Lords have stood the test of time. Fundamental principles we talked about earlier. I championed legislation for the better welfare of horses in transport across Europe, which was good. Fish farming was another one that was good. Empire Windrush, I suppose, really. I championed the cause of one West Indian builder who'd got himself into a tangle with the Home Office and said, well, this is something I think I can help you with. Took him along to the Jamaican High Commission and suddenly found that Empire Windrush was rumbling along, and the High Commissioner of Jamaica and all the other major islands in the West Indies or Caribbean were having the same problem. Lifted the lid, and we found that the again Theresa May policy was anti-Empire Windrush people, and so I stood back, having launched that particular ship, and watched it go, and the government climb down and give justice to people who had hitherto been capped off. I mean, that's something you look back on and smile and pat yourself on the back quietly and think, well, there was a big change there. And indeed, had we not done that, I do believe a lot of people would have been returned to the West Indies who had been believing themselves to be citizens of this country for a very long time. My West Indian builder had served on the jury. He'd done jury service. He was married to an English woman. He had a house, paid his rates and all the rest of it. and was being threatened with transportation back to the West Indies because of a flawed system in the Home Office, and to be able to stop it for one man and then lead on to, I don't know, thousands of others was something you feel rather pleased with.
It's an interesting question about legacy, because obviously your interpretation of what you feel your legacy is may be different. I know it will be different to those who have served under you, because the response that I got to the Ask the Boss question was just overwhelming in terms of the respect that they felt for you. And that, you know, to have created that level of respect, even some years after your departing from the West Midlands, I think was a legacy in itself.
Well, you were good enough to let me see some of the comments, and I felt very humble reading them. And it's nice to read them, and you smile and pat yourself on the back and all that. The interesting thing that came out of that, from my point of view, was that I was able to, I think, affect a lot of change in the West Midlands Police in terms of the budget, in terms of the structure, in terms of its models, it's getting better vehicles, better uniform, and all of that, which is the main job of a chief officer, was not mentioned. The things that were mentioned were what the boss said, and I saw him, and he said it was about personal contact, either with the individual or not. And that's about walking the course. That's about getting out and meeting people who are actually doing the job. And they're the things that they remember, rather than the fact that suddenly the uniforms were better and suddenly the cars started rather than couldn't get out of the yard because the battery was flat.
Absolutely.
It was all about the personal influence that one can have within an organisation. And I think that's a message for society as a whole.
There are certain people who have an impact on us in life, and their leadership abilities rather than management abilities are what create the impact. And I think the reaction that we got to the Ask the Boss questions was reflective of that. Certainly in my life, the people that I've respected most are the people that I've wanted to follow, the people that I've wanted to be led by or happy to be led by. Whereas there are some people that have managed me that I've almost felt resentment for because they were, as you said, clerics rather than leaders.
Well, it's kind of you to say that, and it's nice to hear it. And of course, I'm sitting here with a smirk on my face, but because it goes right through society. Some people will remember Red Robbo,
yes,
who was the shop steward, for those who don't know, communist, self-avowed communist shop steward at Longbridge, when British Leyland was being brought to its knees. Destroyed by Robbo calling strike after strike after strike. And suddenly Michael Edwards, who I met once, little, short, insignificant little man, you'd pass him by in a crowd and never see him. My goodness, what a dynamo. He came in as the chief executive of British Leyland, and what did he do? He walked around in the factory regularly talking to people and listening to them and giving them his point of view as well. And within, 9 months, Red Robbo had gone because Edwards had cut the ground from under his feet by simply talking to the workforce and them saying, wait a minute, we've heard from the boss, Michael Edwards, it's a bit different.
It goes back to what you said earlier on. They felt valued.
It's the same thing. They had never, ever seen the chief executive ever walking on the line, as they used to call it at Longbridge, the Austin.
My dad worked there, yeah.
Some will know what I mean. And yet he did it. And in no time, he turned British Leyland around. It had been very badly damaged by Red Robbo, and it never really picked itself back to its old glory. But he managed to change the whole working ethic simply by talking to people.
I hope you'll forgive a slightly less formal nature of this question, but I ask it because the answer often says a lot about the person's values, whether it's life in general, human behaviour, or the standards we see in society. Is there anything that really frustrates you that you wish people would change, people in general would change?
I think society as a whole is, I might have mentioned this to you before, is over preoccupied with the personality side of it. I'm entitled to this. I've got the rights for that. You see it in people taking selfies of themselves. They're no longer taking a picture of the view; they're taking themselves.
Sense of
smirking at the
entitlement.
camera.
Yeah.
It's you see it in lots of small things in life generally, where people are over preoccupied with themselves and not enough thought given, it seems to me, in the environment and the groupings around them. And so, without wanting to go backwards in time, because you can never go back and capture it, there was something in society a few years back where people did think more in a mannerly sense about people around them. And I think we've lost some of that in society. And it makes society a much more difficult, friction-prone entity. If we thought more about other people and the impact we have on other people in general, both domestic life and work life as well, life would go on in a smoother and a more enjoyable fashion. And how we get back to that, whether it is to do with the decline of established religions, I don't know. Interestingly, the big established religions, like the Muslim faith, the Sikh faith, Buddhism even, still manage to keep their societies together in a much more cohesive way than we do from the Christian ethic. And that might be a comment that I've just made, which is a criticism of the way the church has run itself over the last 20 or 30, 40 years. Without preaching a gospel in every sense of the word, looking back, there was in society a certainty that certain things were done and certain things were not done or said. And I think we perhaps lost some of that.
Yes, I think some of what we said earlier comes back to mind about, the responsibility that rests on the shoulders of people like the media, the social media management companies, the education, the teachers, people who are running large companies. There should be a greater focus on being kind to one another. The kindness, and I know that sounds very wishy-washy, but kindness and compassion towards each other, rather than the combative element that seems to exist now. What would make you feel hopeful about the world your grandchildren are inheriting?
I'm going to duck that one.
Okay.
In the sense that I am, I think the world is a confused and dangerous place.
Yes.
The certainty we had as a child was that Russia might drop a bomb on us. The atom bomb then became the hydrogen bomb, and you got this huge standoff between America and Russia. And yes, our parents were fearful of what would happen if the bomb dropped. But there was a certainty, and you were looking in one direction, which was towards Russia. And are they going to do it? Maybe they won't. And slowly that disappeared. I'm oversimplifying, but at least there was one place that one threat that slowly disappeared. Nowadays, I think because of the way the world has changed and the way politicians have changed and what has happened in America and what is happening in the Ukraine, all of that has made the uncertainty in the world much greater than it was before. You can pick up a handful of countries, more than a handful, who pose one sort of threat or another, military, economic, ethnic, in a way that never happened 30, 40, 50 years ago. And it makes society a much more tenuous place to be. And therefore, I duck the question only in the sense that I don't know what's going to happen, except that I'm somewhat confused and somewhat concerned.
The next question might be just as difficult to answer then. When you hear the phrase happiness in their world, which is obviously the title of these podcast series, what would that mean to you personally?
Well, I understand happiness. I mean, we've talked about that. It can be denigrated as a sort of wishy-washy term, which is not, of course. We know when we're happy and when the people around us are happy. I would extend it towards the things we've talked about with the police service, where you feel valued, where you know what you're doing is recognised, a degree of certainty, a degree of respect, all of which can and should be, I think, bolstered up, which leads in the end to going to work,
yes,
or going home feeling that you've done a good job. that life is actually pretty good and you've done something to improve the environment that other people are in. And sometimes we lose sight of that.
I think it was the Chinese that said that, we must have some form of work to give us a purpose in life, to give us the satisfaction. Without that, we're aimless. And that's the scary prospect that lies ahead for many people with the advancement with AI, because AI is talking about there being thousands, if not millions, of jobs falling off the conveyor belt.
Well, we talked about, I remember in the 1970s, I suppose it was, we talked about the computers, and we would have a paperless society. We've still got paper. Computers would do people out of jobs, and I'm not sure that it has done to a large extent. So I hear the same sort of thing going on with AI. I frankly am confused about AI. I don't fully understand it. I certainly don't know quite what impact it will have on life generally, except it will have a very big impact, there's no doubt whatever. Whether it will be as cataclysmic a change as is forecast, I don't know.
What they're predicting is that organisations that can introduce AI into their business will do so if they haven't already done so, and that will in its effect. We're seeing it now with computerisation when you pick up the telephone to somebody and you've been put through to a computer now, not to a person. And there's going to be more and more and more of that.
It's happening all the time. If you dig around, you can sometimes get on the telephone and get a human being.
Yeah.
But usually you see a telephone symbol on the screen in front of you, and you go through to a chat room. And the chat room, of course, is AI driven.
Really. They call it a chat bot, don't they?
That's right. we know that it's creeping up on us all the time. Yeah. And I'm an Asian generation. I much prefer to talk to somebody on the telephone.
Yeah, me too.
But I'm finding it more and more difficult to get there.
Well, there's one final question from me before I close up. Is there anything you've never been asked in an interview that you wish someone had asked?
You gave me notice of this, and I gave it a great deal of thought, and I couldn't think of anything. I think you've covered the ground here tremendously. And over the years, there was a time when I was being interviewed quite a lot. And one way or another, I think I've covered it. I've probably talked about myself far too much. But no, the short answer is I can't think of anything that has gone unsaid.
Okay.
Except thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be with you.
Okay, well, I'll conclude then just by saying, Lord dear, having served under your command in the 1980s, it's been a real privilege to sit down with you today. I know I'm not speaking just for myself. On behalf of the countless officers, staff and colleagues who had the honour of serving with you, thank you. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your unwavering belief in the importance of integrity, compassion and public service. And most of all, thank you for reminding us that true leadership leaves a lasting mark, not just on organisations, but on the people within them. It's been a pleasure, sir.
It's been my pleasure and a privilege. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Follow the Global Happiness Crusade for more conversations that matter. Click the links below this video to learn more. We'll see you in the next episode of Happiness in Their World. Our free podcast series, Happiness in Their World, isn't about celebrity. Instead, it gives voice to resilience, hope and human wisdom. In our first episodes, you'll hear from a war hero who rebuilt his life after catastrophic injury and loss, a member of the House of Lords and a former Chief Constable who led through national crisis, a celebrated author shaped by her struggles, and a disaster response commander who's seen humanity at its most fragile and its most fierce. These stories aren't always easy to hear, but they're real, and they reveal the truth that happiness isn't the absence of hardship, it's the triumph of the human spirit over it.